Maria wiped down the marble countertop for the third time that morning, not because it was dirty, but because she needed something to do with her hands. The Wellington mansion was so quiet, you could hear your own heartbeat echoing off the walls. 3 months she'd been working here, and still the silence made her uncomfortable. She'd worked in plenty of wealthy homes before. Usually, rich people were loud in their own way. Phone calls about business deals, parties with fancy guests, even arguments about things that didn't matter. But this house felt like a museum where everyone walked on tiptoe, afraid to disturb the ghosts. Richard Wellington owned the place. He was one of those tech billionaires you'd see on magazine covers, always wearing expensive suits and looking serious. His company made software that Maria didn't really understand, but apparently it was important enough to make him ridiculously wealthy. The kind of wealthy where you had 14 bathrooms in one house. But money doesn't buy happiness. Maria's grandmother used to say that, and working here proved it every single day. Richard was never home. And when he was home, he locked himself in his office, barking orders into his phone or typing away on his computer like the world would end if he stopped working. He barely said 2 words to Maria, just a nod when he passed her in the hallway. Sometimes not even that. Then there was Daniel. The boy was only 10 years old, and Maria's heart broke a little every time she saw him. He had his mother's features, people said, soft brown hair that fell over his forehead, and a gentle face that seemed too sad for a child. Daniel had been blind since birth, some genetic condition that the doctors couldn't fix no matter how much money Richard threw at them. The boy spent most of his days alone in his room on the 2nd floor. Tutors came and went, teaching him math and history and science through special textbooks written in Braille. But once the lessons ended, Daniel just sat there. Sometimes by the window where the afternoon sun warmed his face. Sometimes on his bed, running his fingers over the pages of books, reading stories about worlds he could only imagine. Maria had tried talking to him a few times, asking if he wanted snacks or if his room needed anything. Daniel was always polite, always said please and thank you in that quiet voice of his. But he never really talked, never asked questions or told stories like kids his age usually did. It was like something inside him had gone to sleep and no one knew how to wake it up. The house hadn't always been this way. Maria learned that from Betty, the cook who'd been with the family for 7 years. Betty told her everything while chopping vegetables for dinners that Richard usually didn't show up to eat. 2 years ago, there had been a woman in this house, Daniel's mother. Her name was Elena, and by all accounts she'd been the light that kept this family going. She was a concert pianist, trained in some fancy European conservatory. She'd performed all over the world before she met Richard. After Daniel was born and they learned about his condition, she'd given up touring to stay home with her son. Betty said Elena filled the house with music, piano melodies floating through every room, making even the staff stop and listen. She taught music theory at the local university twice a week, and the rest of the time she was with Daniel, reading to him, taking him to parks, making sure he felt loved every single second of every single day. Then she got sick. Cancer. The aggressive kind that doesn't care how much money you have or how many people love you. 6 months from diagnosis to funeral. Richard spent millions on treatments, flew in specialists from 5 different countries, but nothing worked. Elena died on a Tuesday morning in spring, with cherry blossoms blooming outside her window. The music died with her. Richard threw himself into work like a drowning man grabs onto a rope. He was barely home before, but after Elena passed, he practically lived at the office. And Daniel, poor Daniel, just seemed to fade away. The boy who used to laugh at his mother's jokes and hum along to her piano playing became a ghost in his own home. Maria understood grief. She'd lost people too. Her father when she was 16. Her younger brother in an accident 3 years ago. But she'd also learned that grief couldn't be your whole life. At some point, you had to find a reason to keep going. These two, father and son, they'd forgotten how to do that. It was a Thursday afternoon when everything started to change. Maria was on the 1st floor, cleaning the rooms that nobody used. The Wellington house had a formal living room, a sitting room, a library, and a music room. All of them perfectly decorated, perfectly maintained, and perfectly empty. The music room was the worst. A beautiful grand piano sat in the center, black and shiny like a luxury car. It was a Steinway, Betty had mentioned once, the kind that costs as much as a small house. Elena's piano, her baby. She'd spent hours at that bench every day, her fingers dancing across the keys. Now it just sat there collecting dust. Richard had made it clear when Maria was hired that nobody was to touch that piano. Not to play it, not even to clean it beyond a simple dusting. It was sacred ground, untouchable. Maria was running her feather duster across the top when she heard a sound behind her, a small gasp, barely audible. She turned around and found Daniel standing in the doorway. The boy didn't know she was there. He couldn't see her, obviously, but his head was tilted slightly like he was listening to something only he could hear. His whole body was oriented toward the piano, and there was an expression on his face that Maria had never seen before. Longing. Pure, desperate longing. Daniel took a small step forward, then another. His hands were outstretched, feeling the air in front of him. He'd been in this house his whole life. He knew every room, every corner, every piece of furniture. He could navigate the entire mansion without help. But right now he moved slowly, carefully, like he was approaching something holy. When his fingers touched the edge of the piano, his whole body seemed to relax. He ran his hands along the smooth wood, tracing the curves with a gentle touch that reminded Maria of how someone might touch a photograph of a person they'd lost. Then his fingers found the keys. He didn't press them, just rested his small hands on the cool ivory, feeling the potential beneath his fingertips. His eyes were closed, even though they couldn't see anyway, and there were tears running down his cheeks. Maria felt her own eyes getting wet. This boy missed his mother, and more than that, he missed the music. The piano was more than just an instrument. It was a connection to the woman who'd loved him, who'd filled his world with beauty when he couldn't see it with his eyes. Daniel stood there for a long moment, his hands on the keys, not making a sound. Then he heard Maria's breath, or maybe the small sob she couldn't quite hold back, and he snatched his hands away like he'd touched fire. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice panicked. "I know I'm not supposed to. Please don't tell my father, please." Maria watched him turn and hurry out of the room, his hands trailing along the wall to guide him back to the staircase. She stood there in the empty music room, staring at the piano, her mind racing. That night, Maria couldn't sleep. She kept seeing Daniel's face, that expression of longing mixed with fear. A 10-year-old boy afraid to touch a piano because his father's grief had turned it into a forbidden object. It wasn't right. None of this was right. By the time the sun came up, Maria had made a decision. It was risky. It could cost her this job, and she needed this job. The pay was good, better than she'd made anywhere else. She was sending money home to her mother in Honduras every month, saving up to bring her little sister to the States for college. But some things mattered more than job security. That little boy needed music. He needed something to connect him to his mother, something to bring light back into his dark world. And if his father was too consumed by his own pain to see that, then someone else would have to step in. Maria was going to teach Daniel how to play piano, even if it meant doing it in secret, even if it meant risking everything, because that's what Elena would have wanted. And someone in this house needed to remember that love was more important than rules. Maria spent the entire next day watching Richard's schedule like a hawk. He left the house at 6 in the morning, same as always. Betty mentioned he had meetings in San Francisco and wouldn't be back until late evening. That gave them time. Enough time to at least try. The hard part was approaching Daniel. The boy barely knew her beyond the polite hellos they exchanged in passing. How do you walk up to a lonely child and offer him the one thing his father had forbidden? How do you earn that kind of trust? She found him after lunch, sitting in his usual spot by his bedroom window. The afternoon sun streamed through the glass, warming the side of his face. He was reading a book in Braille, his fingers moving across the pages with practiced ease. Maria knocked softly on the doorframe. "Daniel, it's Maria, the housekeeper," He looked up, his unseeing eyes turning in her direction. "Hi. Do you need something?" Her heart was pounding so hard she was sure he could hear it. "Actually, I wanted to ask you something. Yesterday in the music room, you really wanted to touch that piano, didn't you?" Daniel's face went pale. His hands clutched the book tighter. "I said I was sorry, I won't do it again." "What if I told you that you could?" Maria said softly, stepping into the room. "What if I told you that you could not just touch it, but learn to play it?" The boy's mouth opened slightly like he wanted to say something but couldn't find the words. Finally, he whispered, "My father said no one is allowed to play my mother's piano. I know what your father said." Maria sat down in the chair across from him. "But Daniel, your mother was a pianist. A beautiful pianist. Don't you think she bought that piano hoping that someday you might play it too?" "She used to play for me," Daniel said quietly. "Every night before bed, she'd make up songs about dragons and castles and adventures. Sometimes I'd sit on the bench next to her, and she'd let me touch the keys while she played. She said music wasn't about seeing. It was about feeling." Maria felt a lump forming in her throat. She was right. Music is about feeling. And I think she'd want you to feel it again. "But father, your father is hurting," Maria interrupted gently. "He lost the woman he loved, and sometimes when people hurt that badly, they make decisions that don't make sense. They try to freeze everything in place because they're afraid of losing even more. But Daniel, keeping that piano silent isn't honoring your mother's memory. It's burying it." Daniel was quiet for a long moment. His fingers had stopped moving across the braille pages. "Do you know how to play piano?" Maria smiled even though he couldn't see it. "I do. I studied at a conservatory back home in Honduras. I was going to be a concert pianist too, actually. But life had other plans. What happened? My father got sick. Medical bills. I had to leave school and find work to help my family. I ended up cleaning houses instead of playing concert halls." She laughed softly. "Not quite the same thing, but you do what you have to do for the people you love." "Do you miss it?" "Playing? Every single day," Maria admitted. "But you know what I'd miss even more? Watching a talented child give up on something beautiful because he's afraid. So I'm asking you, Daniel, do you want to learn?" The boy's face went through about a dozen emotions in the span of 10 seconds. Fear, hope, excitement, worry. Finally, he whispered, "What if father finds out?" "He won't find out if we're careful. He's gone most days until evening. We'll practice in the afternoons and you'll learn to listen for his car in the driveway. If you hear it, you go straight to your room. We'll make it work." "Why would you risk your job for me?" Daniel asked. "You don't even know me." Maria reached over and gently took his hand. "Because every child deserves to have music in their life, and because I think your mother is up there somewhere, hoping someone would be brave enough to do this." Daniel's eyes filled with tears. He nodded slowly. "Okay, I want to learn." That's how it started. That very afternoon, Maria led Daniel down the stairs and into the music room. His hand gripped hers tightly, like he was afraid this might all disappear if he let go. When they reached the piano bench, she helped him sit down. "Put your hands on the keys," she instructed. "Just rest them there. Feel the smoothness. Each key is a different note, a different voice. Together they make a language." Daniel's hands trembled as he placed them on the keyboard. The moment his fingers touched the ivory, something changed in his face. It was like watching someone come home after a long journey. "Now," Maria said, sitting beside him, "let's start with something simple. Middle C, this is the center of the piano right here." She guided his right thumb to the key. "Press it gently." He pressed it, and a single note rang out through the room. Clear and pure. Daniel gasped. "That's C," Maria said. "Now next to it is D." She moved his finger one key to the right. "Press another note." Daniel's face broke into the first real smile Maria had seen from him. They spent an hour on just the basic scale. C, D, E, F, G, A, B, and back to C again. Maria taught him to feel the pattern, to understand that the piano wasn't random. It was organized, predictable. Once you learned the pattern, you could find your way around the entire keyboard. "Every octave is the same," she explained. "Same pattern of white keys and black keys repeating over and over. So once you learn one section, you know the whole piano." Daniel was a fast learner, faster than Maria had expected. By the end of that first lesson, he could play the C major scale with both hands, slowly with plenty of mistakes, but he could do it. "That's enough for today. Maria finally said, glancing at the clock. Your father will be home in about an hour. We should stop. Can we do this again tomorrow? Daniel asked eagerly. Tomorrow and every day after, Maria promised. But remember, this is our secret. You can't tell anyone. Not your tutors, not Betty, and definitely not your father. I promise, Daniel said solemnly, then quieter. Thank you, Maria. This is the happiest I've felt since Mom died. Maria had to turn away so he wouldn't hear her crying. You're welcome, sweetheart. Now let's get you back upstairs before your father gets home. The next day they met again, and the day after that, Maria started teaching Daniel simple melodies. Twinkle, twinkle, little star. Mary Had a Little Lamb. Songs that most kids learned when they were 5 or 6. But Daniel attacked them with the focus of someone much older. Within a week, he was playing them perfectly. Within 2 weeks, he was adding his own little flourishes, extra notes that weren't in the original melody but somehow made it sound better. You have a gift, Maria told him one afternoon, amazed. A real, genuine gift. Mom used to say music was in our blood, Daniel said, his fingers still moving across the keys. She said some people are born understanding it, like it's a language they already knew before they were born. As the weeks turned into a month, then 2 months, Maria watched Daniel transform. The quiet, withdrawn boy started coming alive. He smiled more. He talked more. He started asking questions about everything. About Maria's life, about Honduras, about what the world looked like beyond his bedroom window. And the music. God, the music he was making. It wasn't just practice scales anymore. Daniel was composing his own pieces. Little melodies that popped into his head that he'd work on until they were perfect. Play me what you're feeling, Maria would say. Happy, sad, angry, peaceful. Let the piano tell the story. One afternoon, about 3 months into their secret lessons, Daniel played something that made Maria stop in her tracks. It was a melody unlike anything she'd taught him. Haunting and beautiful, with a sadness that seemed too mature for a 10-year-old. What's that? She asked when he finished. It's for my mom, Daniel said quietly. I've been working on it for a few weeks. I wanted it to sound like how I remember her voice. Soft and warm, but also kind of sad because she's not here anymore. Maria couldn't speak. This child, this blind, lonely, heartbroken child, was creating something so beautiful it hurt to listen to it. It's perfect, she finally managed to say. Your mother would be so proud of you. They had a system now. A routine. Every afternoon at 2 o'clock, when Richard was safely at his office across town, they'd meet in the music room. Daniel would practice for an hour, sometimes longer. Maria would guide him through new techniques, new pieces, new challenges. She taught him about rhythm and timing, about dynamics, how to make some notes loud and others soft, about pedals and how they could make the sound linger or stop abruptly. She taught him everything she'd learned at that conservatory in Honduras, all those years ago when she'd dreamed of being a concert pianist herself. But more than that, she gave him something to live for, something to be excited about. Daniel started waking up early, eager for afternoon to come. He'd practice his scales silently on his desk, his fingers moving through the patterns, preparing for their lesson. Betty noticed the change. That boy is different lately, she mentioned to Maria one morning. He's humming. I heard him humming yesterday. He hasn't done that since his mother was alive. Maria just smiled and said nothing, but secrets have a way of coming out. No matter how careful you are, no matter how many precautions you take, eventually, the truth finds its way into the light. It was a rainy Tuesday afternoon, almost 4 months into their lessons. Daniel was working on a complicated piece by Chopin that Maria had adapted for his skill level. His fingers were flying across the keys, completely absorbed in the music. Neither of them heard the car pull into the driveway 20 minutes early. Neither of them heard the front door open, or the footsteps crossing the marble foyer. Richard Wellington had come home early from a canceled meeting, and as he walked through his silent house, he heard something that stopped him dead in his tracks. Piano music. Beautiful, skilled, emotional piano music coming from the room that had been silent for 2 years. His first thought was anger. Someone was in his house playing his dead wife's piano, violating the one rule he'd made clear to everyone. But as he walked toward the music room, his anger began to shift into confusion. Because something about that playing was familiar. The way certain notes were emphasized, the slight hesitation before difficult passages, the emotional weight behind each phrase. He reached the doorway and looked inside, and his entire world stopped. Richard stood frozen in the doorway, his briefcase still in his hand, his expensive suit getting damp from the rain he'd just walked through, but he didn't notice any of that. All he could see was his son. Daniel sat at Elena's piano, his small hands moving across the keys with a confidence that seemed impossible. His eyes were closed, his face tilted slightly upward, completely lost in the music, and standing next to him, one hand resting gently on the boy's shoulder, was Maria. The piece Daniel was playing was one of Elena's favorites, a Chopin nocturne that she used to perform at recitals. Richard had heard her play it 100 times, maybe more. He knew every note, every pause, every subtle emotion she'd poured into it, and his son was playing it. Not perfectly, not with the technical mastery Elena had possessed, but with something else. Something that made Richard's chest feel like it was being crushed. Daniel was playing it with love. The music ended. Daniel's hands lifted from the keys, and for a moment there was only silence. Then the boy spoke, his voice happy and proud. "How was that, Maria? Did I get the timing right in the middle section?" I felt like maybe I rushed it a little. Maria opened her mouth to respond, but before she could say anything, Richard spoke. "Daniel." Just one word, just his son's name. But it came out choked and raw, barely more than a whisper. Daniel's entire body went rigid. His face drained of color. Maria felt him start to shake under her hand. "Father," Daniel breathed, terror filling his voice. I can explain." "I'm sorry. Please don't be angry. Please don't fire Maria. This was my idea. I begged her to teach me. It's not her fault." The words tumbled out of Daniel in a panicked rush. Maria stepped forward, positioning herself slightly in front of the boy, her heart hammering so hard she thought it might burst. "Mr. Wellington," she said, forcing her voice to stay steady even though her hands were shaking. "Daniel is telling the truth. This was my decision. I saw how much he wanted to play, and I couldn't stand watching him suffer. If you need to fire me, I understand. But please don't punish Daniel. He hasn't done anything wrong. He's been honoring his mother's memory, not disrespecting it." Richard still hadn't moved from the doorway. His face was doing something strange, something Maria couldn't quite read. His jaw was clenched tight, and there were tears running down his cheeks. "How long?" he finally asked, his voice rough. 4 months, sir," Maria answered quietly. 4 months. Richard repeated the words like he couldn't quite believe them. "You've been teaching my son piano for 4 months, and I never knew." "I'm sorry," Daniel whispered, his voice breaking. "I know you said no one could touch Mom's piano. I know it was sacred. But I missed her so much, and the music. The music made me feel close to her again." Something in Richard's face crumbled at those words. He walked slowly into the room, his footsteps echoing on the hardwood floor. Maria's muscles tensed, ready to argue, ready to fight for this boy if she had to. But Richard didn't look angry. He looked destroyed. He stopped in front of the piano bench and just stared at his son, really looked at him, maybe for the first time in 2 years. Daniel sat there, his shoulders hunched, his hands clasped in his lap, waiting for the punishment he was sure would come. "When your mother was pregnant with you," Richard said softly, "we didn't know yet that you'd be blind. The doctors told us after you were born. I remember your mother crying that night. Not because she was disappointed in you. Never that, but because she was afraid. Afraid of all the things you might not be able to do. Afraid the world would be harder for you." Daniel's head lifted slightly, confusion mixing with his fear. "But the next morning," Richard continued, his voice thick with emotion, "she came to me with this determination in her eyes. She said that you might not be able to see the world, but you'd experience it in ways that other people couldn't. Through touch, through sound, through music." He knelt down beside the piano bench, bringing himself to Daniel's level. "She bought this piano 2 days later, spent a fortune on it. I thought she was crazy. You were just a baby. But she said, 'This piano is for Daniel. Someday when he's ready, he's going to play it. And when he does, he's going to be extraordinary.'" A sob broke free from Daniel's chest. "She said that?" "She said that," Richard confirmed, reaching out to touch his son's face. "Your mother made me promise that when you were old enough, I'd make sure you learned piano. But when she died, I couldn't keep that promise. Every time I looked at this piano, all I could see was her. All I could hear was her music, and I couldn't bear it." Richard turned to look at Maria, and she saw something in his eyes that made her own fill with tears. It wasn't anger. It was gratitude. I failed my son, Richard said, his voice cracking. I was so buried in my own grief that I forgot he was grieving too. I took away the one thing that could have connected him to his mother because I was too much of a coward to face my own pain. Mr. Wellington, Maria started, but he shook his head. You did what I should have done, he said. You saw what Daniel needed and you gave it to him, even though it could have cost you your job. You risked everything for a boy you barely knew because it was the right thing to do. He looked back at Daniel. Play something for me, please. Play whatever you want. Daniel hesitated, his hands hovering uncertainly over the keys. You're not angry? I'm not angry, Richard said gently. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. Slowly, Daniel placed his hands on the keyboard. He started playing, and this time it wasn't Chopin or any classical piece Maria had taught him. It was one of his own compositions, the one he'd written for his mother. The melody was simple but achingly beautiful. It started soft and gentle like a lullaby, then grew more complex. There were moments of sadness, yes, but also moments of joy, moments that captured what it felt like to remember someone you loved. The happiness and the heartbreak all mixed together. Richard listened, his hand pressed against his mouth, tears streaming freely now. Maria stood a few feet away, giving father and son this moment, her own cheeks wet. When the piece ended, Richard pulled Daniel into his arms. The boy was stiff at first, surprised. They hadn't hugged in so long. But then Daniel melted into his father's embrace and both of them started sobbing. I miss her, Daniel cried into his father's shoulder. I miss her so much, I know. I miss her too. Richard held his son tighter. But she's not really gone, is she? She's in this music. She's in you. Every note you play, every piece you compose, that's her living on through you. They stayed like that for a long time, holding each other, crying together for the first time since the funeral. Maria quietly turned to leave to give them privacy, but Richard's voice stopped her. Maria, wait, please. She turned back. Richard had released Daniel but kept one arm around his shoulders. Both of them looked at her with red, swollen eyes. I need to say thank you, Richard said. Those two words don't even come close to expressing what I owe you. You gave my son back his life. You gave him hope. You gave him something I was too broken to give him. I just did what any decent person would do, Maria said softly. No, Richard shook his head firmly. Most people would have followed the rules. Most people would have minded their own business. You saw a child suffering and decided rules weren't more important than his happiness. That takes courage. He stood up, walking over to face her directly. Please don't leave. I know I've been a terrible employer, distant and cold and completely oblivious to what was happening in my own house. But I'm asking you, begging you to stay. Not just as our housekeeper. Daniel needs you. He needs his teacher. Maria looked past Richard to where Daniel sat on the piano bench, hope written all over his young face. Please stay, Maria, Daniel added. I still have so much to learn. I'll stay, Maria said, a smile breaking through her tears. Of course I'll stay. Richard's shoulders sagged with relief. Thank you. And I want to pay you more. A lot more. For teaching Daniel. For caring about him when I was too lost in my own pain to do it properly. I don't need more money, Maria started to protest, but Richard held up his hand. Yes, you do. Betty told me you send money home to your family. Your mother and your sister. Let me help with that. It's the least I can do. Before Maria could respond, Daniel spoke up. Father, can Maria still be my main teacher? Even if you hire other people to help? Richard smiled. Actually smiled. It was the first time Maria had seen his face do anything other than frown. Maria will always be your main teacher. I promise. He looked back at the piano, then at his son. Do you think there's room on that bench for one more? Daniel's face lit up. You want to play? I want to learn, Richard corrected. I never learned piano. Your mother tried to teach me once, but I was always too busy with work. I've regretted that every day since she died. Maybe it's not too late to fix that mistake. It's never too late to learn, Maria said warmly. Music doesn't care how old you are. Richard sat down beside Daniel on the bench. Father and son side by side the way they should have been all along. Okay, Richard said, looking at his hands uncertainly. Where do I start? Middle C, Daniel said confidently, reaching over to guide his father's hand to the right key. This is where everyone starts. Maria stood back and watched as Daniel began teaching his father the same scale she'd taught him 4 months ago. The boy's voice was patient and clear, explaining each note with the kind of understanding that only comes from having learned it yourself. And Richard listened. Really listened. Not checking his phone, not thinking about work, not mentally calculating business deals. He was fully present, focused entirely on his son, learning something new together. The music room that had been silent for 2 years was filled with sound again. Halting, imperfect sound as Richard struggled with the basic scale, but it was beautiful anyway. Because it wasn't about the notes being perfect, it was about a family starting to heal. Maria quietly slipped out of the room, leaving them to their lesson. As she walked down the hallway, she could still hear the piano. She could hear Daniel's encouraging voice and Richard's occasional laugh when he hit the wrong key. She thought about what Betty had said weeks ago, that this house used to be filled with music when Elena was alive. Maybe, just maybe, it could be filled with music again. The changes didn't happen overnight. Real healing never does. But over the next few weeks, Maria watched the Wellington household transform in ways she never could have imagined. Richard started coming home earlier. Not just an hour earlier, but actually leaving work at reasonable times. Some days he'd arrive at 4 in the afternoon, walking straight to the music room where Daniel was practicing. He'd sit in one of the chairs and just listen, his eyes closed, a small smile on his face. Other days he'd join Daniel at the piano bench for his own lessons. Maria had never seen a grown man struggle so much with something so simple. Richard Wellington could run a billion-dollar company, could make decisions that affected thousands of people, but ask him to play a simple scale and his fingers turned into clumsy sticks. No, Daniel would say, trying not to giggle. Father, that's E-flat. You want E natural. 1 key to the right. They all look the same to me, Richard would grumble, but there was warmth in his voice. Affection. Things that had been missing for so long. Betty noticed it first. One morning, about 3 weeks after the discovery, she pulled Maria aside in the kitchen. "What did you do to this family?" she asked, her eyes wide with wonder. "What do you mean?" "I mean, Mr. Wellington actually sat at the breakfast table this morning. With Daniel. They ate together and talked about music theory, whatever that is. I've worked here for 7 years and I've never seen him eat breakfast at home. He was always gone before the sun came up." Maria smiled. "People can change when they remember what's important. Well, whatever magic you worked, keep it up. That little boy deserves to have a father, not just a man who pays the bills." But Richard wasn't just changing at home. One evening, he called Maria into his office. She went nervously, still not entirely comfortable in this new dynamic where her boss actually noticed she existed. "Sit down, please," Richard said, gesturing to the chair across from his desk. Maria sat, her hands folded in her lap. "I've been thinking," Richard began, leaning back in his chair. "Daniel is incredibly gifted. In just 4 months, you've taught him things that should take years to learn. But I want to make sure he's getting the best possible education, not because I think you're not good enough," he added quickly, seeing her expression, "but because every great musician needs multiple perspectives." Maria relaxed a little. "I agree. There are piano teachers out there with much more training than I have. I only studied for 2 years before I had to leave school. I want to hire some of them," Richard said. "The best instructors in the country. But only if you stay on as Daniel's primary teacher. He trusts you. He learns from you in a way that goes beyond just the technical skills. You understand him?" "I'd be honored," Maria said softly. "Good. I'll have them come here to the house, maybe 2 or 3 times a week. They can teach Daniel advanced techniques, music theory, composition, but you're still his foundation, his guide. Is that acceptable to you?" "More than acceptable." Richard nodded, then reached into his desk drawer and pulled out an envelope. "I also want to talk about your salary. And before you protest, just listen. Betty told me about your mother in Honduras. About your sister who wants to go to college. You're sending them most of your paycheck every month, aren't you?" Maria felt her cheeks flush. "My family needs the help, sir. My mother is getting older and my sister is so smart. She deserves a chance at education even if I didn't get to finish mine." "What if I told you that you could finish yours?" Richard said. "There's an excellent music conservatory here in the city. I've already spoken to the dean. They'd be willing to accept you as a returning student. You could complete your degree while continuing to teach Daniel." Maria's mouth fell open. "Mr. Wellington, I can't afford—" "I'll pay for it," Richard interrupted. "Tuition, books, everything. And I'm tripling your salary. No, don't argue, he said as Maria started to protest. You've given my family something priceless. You've given me my son back. You've reminded me how to be a father. Money is the least of what I owe you. Tears welled up in Maria's eyes. Why are you doing this? Because you saw my son as a person, not just a responsibility. Because you risked your job to give him something beautiful. And because my wife would have wanted me to help someone who dedicated their life to music. He paused, his voice getting softer. Elena always said that music teachers were the most important people in the world. She said they didn't just teach notes and rhythms. They taught people how to hear beauty, how to express emotions they didn't have words for. She'd be furious with me if I didn't help you finish what you started. Maria wiped her eyes. Thank you. This means more than you could possibly know. The first visiting instructor arrived 2 weeks later. His name was Professor Chen, and he'd taught at Juilliard for 20 years before retiring. Richard had somehow convinced him to come out of retirement to work with Daniel. Maria was nervous about meeting him. This man had taught some of the greatest pianists in the world. What would he think of her teaching methods? Would he tell Richard that she'd been doing everything wrong? Professor Chen was a small elderly man with kind eyes and hands that still moved with the grace of someone who'd spent their entire life playing piano. He listened to Daniel play for almost an hour, never interrupting, just observing. When Daniel finished his last piece, Professor Chen was quiet for a long moment. Then he turned to Maria. How long did you say you've been teaching him? About 5 months now, Maria answered, her voice uncertain. Remarkable, truly remarkable. He looked back at Daniel. Young man, you have something very special. Raw talent, yes, but more than that. You play with emotion, with understanding. That's not something that can be taught. That comes from inside. Daniel's face lit up with pride. Professor Chen spent the rest of the afternoon working with Daniel on more advanced techniques. Hand position, wrist movement, how to use your whole body to create sound, not just your fingers. Maria watched and learned right alongside Daniel, taking mental notes of everything the professor said. After the lesson, Professor Chen pulled Maria aside. You've done an excellent job with him, he said warmly. Your foundation work is solid. You've taught him to love the music first and the technique second. That's the right order. Many teachers do it backward, and they create students who can play perfectly but have no soul in their music. Thank you, Maria said, relief flooding through her. I was worried I might have taught him bad habits. Not at all. In fact, I'd like to work with you as well if you're interested. Richard told me you're returning to conservatory. I could tutor you privately, help you prepare for the more advanced courses. Maria couldn't believe what she was hearing. Professor Chen was a legend in the classical music world, and he was offering to teach her? I would be honored, she managed to say. More instructors came. A music theory teacher who helped Daniel understand the mathematics behind the beauty. A composition teacher who encouraged him to write more of his own pieces. Each one was amazed by Daniel's progress, and each one praised Maria for the foundation she'd built. But the best changes weren't the fancy teachers or the improved techniques. The best changes were the small, everyday moments. Like the evening Maria found Richard and Daniel in the music room at 9 o'clock at night, long after lessons were supposed to be over. Richard was attempting to play a duet with his son, messing up constantly but laughing every time he hit the wrong note. Daniel was patient, counting out the rhythm, encouraging his father the same way Maria had encouraged him. Or the Saturday morning when Daniel came running to find her, so excited he could barely get the words out. Maria, Father says we're going to a concert, a real concert at the Symphony Hall. We're going together. Richard appeared behind him looking slightly embarrassed but happy. I haven't been to a concert since Elena died. I thought it was time. Would you like to join us? We have an extra ticket. The concert was beautiful. They sat in the concert hall, Daniel between Maria and his father, listening to a full orchestra perform Beethoven and Mozart. Daniel's face was rapturous, his hands occasionally moving on his lap as if playing along with the musicians on stage. During intermission, a well-dressed woman approached them. She'd been sitting nearby and had noticed how engaged Daniel was with the music. Is your son a musician? She asked Richard. He is, Richard said, and there was pride in his voice. Real, genuine pride. He plays piano. He's quite talented. There's a youth music competition next month, the woman said. The Regional Young Musicians Showcase. They have a category for pianists under 12. You should consider entering him." After she walked away, Richard looked at Maria. "What do you think? Is he ready for something like that?" "I don't know," Maria admitted. "Daniel, how would you feel about playing in front of people? In a competition?" Daniel was quiet for a moment, considering. "Would I be competing against kids who can see?" "Yes," Maria said honestly. "Does that bother you?" "No," Daniel said slowly. "Mom always told me that being blind didn't mean I couldn't do things. It just meant I'd do them differently. I think I want to try." Richard squeezed his son's shoulder. "Then we'll enter you. But no pressure, okay? Whether you win or lose doesn't matter. What matters is that you're brave enough to try." Over the next month, they prepared. Daniel practiced his competition piece until he could play it in his sleep. It was one of his own compositions, the piece he'd written for his mother. Maria suggested it because it showcased not just his technical skill, but his emotional depth. Professor Chen helped him refine it, adding little touches that made it even more powerful. Richard listened to it so many times he could probably hum every note. The night before the competition, Daniel couldn't sleep. Maria found him sitting in the music room at midnight, just touching the piano keys without pressing them down. "Nervous?" she asked gently. "Terrified," Daniel admitted. "What if I mess up? What if I embarrass Father?" Maria sat beside him on the bench. "Your father is already proud of you. Win or lose, that won't change. And you know what? Your mother is proud of you too. Wherever she is, she's watching you become the musician she always knew you'd be." "Do you really think so?" "I know so," Maria said firmly. "Now come on. You need sleep. Tomorrow is a big day." As they walked out of the music room together, Daniel reached for Maria's hand. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for everything. For teaching me. For believing in me. For helping my dad remember how to be my dad again." Maria squeezed his hand. "You don't need to thank me. You did all the hard work. I just opened the door. You're the one who walked through it. Tomorrow would be the competition. Tomorrow Daniel would show the world what he could do. But tonight Maria felt something she hadn't felt in years. Hope. Pure, beautiful hope that everything was going to be okay. The morning of the competition, Daniel threw up twice before breakfast. Richard stood outside the bathroom door looking helpless until Maria gently moved him aside and went in to help the boy. "It's okay," she said softly, rubbing Daniel's back. "Every performer gets nervous. Your mother used to get sick before concerts too. She said it meant she cared about doing well." "Really?" Daniel asked, his voice small. "Really? She told me once that the day she stopped being nervous was the day she'd stop being great. Nerves mean you care. They mean it matters to you." By the time they arrived at the concert hall, Daniel had calmed down a little, but Maria could feel his hand shaking in hers as they walked through the building. The place was crowded with parents and young musicians, all dressed in their best clothes, all looking confident and prepared. "There are a lot of people here," Daniel whispered, his face pale. "There are," Maria agreed. "But none of them have your gift. None of them have your story." They found seats in the audience section. Daniel would be performing 5th out of 12 contestants. They had to sit through 4 performances first, and each one was impressive. A girl who played Rachmaninoff with technical perfection. A boy who performed Liszt with incredible speed. Maria felt Richard tense beside her with each performance. "They're all so good," he muttered. "Daniel is better," Maria said confidently, and she meant it. Finally, the announcer called Daniel's name. "Our next performer is Daniel Wellington, age 10, performing an original composition titled For Mother." Richard squeezed Daniel's shoulder. "Remember, win or lose, I'm proud of you." "We both are," Maria added. Daniel stood up and Maria guided him to the stage. She helped him find the piano bench, made sure he was positioned correctly, then stepped back. Daniel would have to do this part alone. The audience fell silent. Daniel sat there for a moment, his hands resting in his lap, and Maria wondered if he was going to freeze. If the fear was going to be too much. Then Daniel placed his hands on the keys and began to play. The first notes were soft, almost hesitant, like someone remembering something beautiful but distant. Then the melody grew stronger, more confident. The piece was everything Daniel had worked on for the past month, but it was also more than that. It was his heart poured out through the piano. Maria watched the audience as much as she watched Daniel. She saw people leaning forward in their seats. She saw tears forming in eyes. This wasn't just a performance. It was a story told in music. The story of a boy who loved his mother, who missed her every day, who found a way to keep her memory alive through the one thing she'd loved most. The music swelled and dipped, moving through different emotions. Joy and sorrow, love and loss, hope and heartbreak. Daniel's whole body moved with the piece swaying slightly, his face showing every feeling the music expressed. When he played the final notes, letting them ring out in the silent hall before fading away, there was a moment of absolute stillness. Then the audience erupted. People were on their feet, applauding, some wiping their eyes. It wasn't just polite applause. It was the kind of response that said they'd witnessed something special. Maria felt tears streaming down her face. Beside her, Richard was openly crying, clapping so hard his hands must have hurt. Betty, who'd insisted on coming along, was sobbing into a tissue. Daniel stood and took a small bow, the way Maria had taught him. Even though he couldn't see the standing ovation, he could hear it. He could feel it. And the smile on his face was the most beautiful thing Maria had ever seen. After all the performers had finished, there was a break while the judges deliberated. Maria found Daniel backstage, surrounded by other young musicians and their parents. "You were amazing," a girl about Daniel's age was saying. "I've never heard anything like that. Did you really write it yourself?" "I did," Daniel said shyly. "My teacher helped me, but yeah, mostly me." "Is your teacher here?" another kid asked. "I want to meet them." Daniel's face lit up. "Maria, where are you?" Maria stepped forward, and suddenly she was surrounded by parents asking questions. Where did she teach? Did she take on new students? How had she trained someone so young to compose original music? Richard appeared beside her, running interference. "Maria teaches privately," he said politely but firmly. "And she's currently only working with my son." One mother looked at Daniel with curiosity. "Is it true you've only been playing for 6 months?" "Almost 6 months, yeah," Daniel confirmed. The woman shook her head in disbelief. "That's incredible. My daughter has been playing for 4 years and she's not half as good." Finally, the announcer called everyone back to the auditorium for the awards. Maria's stomach was in knots. She wanted Daniel to win, not for the trophy, but because she wanted the world to recognize what she already knew. That this boy was special. They announced third place first, a boy who'd played Mozart. Then second place, the girl who'd performed Rachmaninoff. Maria felt Richard's hand grip hers tightly. And first place, the announcer said, drawing out the moment, goes to Daniel Wellington for his original composition. For Mother, the audience exploded into applause again. Daniel's face went through about 5 different emotions in 2 seconds. Shock, disbelief, joy, pride. Then he was crying, and Richard was hugging him, and Maria was hugging both of them, and everyone was crying and laughing at the same time. Daniel had to go on stage to accept his trophy. The head judge, a distinguished-looking woman who taught at a prestigious music academy, handed it to him personally. "Young man," she said into the microphone, "I've been judging these competitions for 15 years. I've heard thousands of young musicians, but what you did today was something different. You didn't just play music. You made us feel something. You reminded us why music exists, not just to show off technical skill, but to connect human hearts." She turned to address the full audience. "This young man is blind. He learned to play piano in less than 6 months, and he composed this piece himself as a tribute to his late mother. If that's not the spirit of music, I don't know what is." More applause, more tears. Daniel stood there holding his trophy. And even though he couldn't see the audience, his face showed that he understood. He'd done something meaningful, something real. After the ceremony, as they were leaving the concert hall, a man in an expensive suit approached them. He introduced himself as the director of the city's youth symphony orchestra. "Mr. Wellington," he said, shaking Richard's hand, "your son is extraordinarily talented. I'd like to discuss opportunities for him. Performances with our youth orchestra. Possibly a feature at our winter gala. We rarely showcase such young musicians, but Daniel is clearly exceptional." Richard looked at Daniel, then at Maria. "What do you think?" "I think," Maria said, smiling at Daniel, "that the world deserves to hear his music, but only if he wants to share it." "I want to," Daniel said firmly. "I want to play for people. I want them to hear what I hear, what Mom taught me to hear." That night, back at the Wellington house, they had a celebration. Betty made Daniel's favorite dinner, and they all sat around the dining room table together. Not just the family, but Maria and Betty too, because somewhere along the way they'd all become a family. After dinner, Daniel wanted to play piano. Not to practice, just to play for the joy of it. Richard sat beside him on the bench attempting to play harmony, while Daniel carried the melody.